for joining today's Introduction to Repositioning Public Housing webinar series. All webinar participants have been muted upon entry, and if you would like to notify our team of any technical difficulties, please send us a message in the chat box. My name is Kayla Prendergast, and I am one of your hosts today with Mike Andrews, Principal of Structure Development. Before Mike begins, I have a few housekeeping items that I want to address. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can ask them in two ways. First, you can verbally share your question by selecting the hand icon in the right-hand navigation panel, and I will unmute your line. Or you can also send me a message saying you would like to have your line unmuted, and you can ask your question in that way. If you don't have the functionality to be able to share your question verbally, you can also type your question in the chat box in the navigation panel, and I'll read it aloud. If we're unable to address all questions, we will send an email reply after the webinar. Mike will present for approximately 2.5 hours, and we will leave 30 minutes at the end for a question and answer session. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on HUD Exchange shortly following the webinar. When the webinar is over, a screen will open with a short survey for attendees to complete. We appreciate any feedback on today's webinar and ideas that you may have for future webinars. I'll now hand it over to Mike to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Kaylin. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the second in our series of asset repositioning trainings. Again, my name is Mike Andrews, and I'll be your trainer for today. A couple of things to mention before we jump into today's topics. Same ground rules as our last session. Please feel free to ask questions. I'd like to encourage folks' participation throughout the training. We'll do our best to unmute lines and let people ask questions directly. I'd like to try to make this as interactive and tailored to folks' situations as possible so everyone gets the most out of this. Also want to let folks know that we shared in advance of today questions that were asked that we ran out of time and couldn't get to at our last session. So that information was sent directly to folks, and we'll do our best to get through today's materials in enough time to leave ample room at the end for questions and answers. So again, this is the second in a four-part series. Today's session is focused on Section 18 and Streamlined Voluntary Conversion. Streamlined Voluntary Conversion is also sometimes referred to as Section 22. So don't get confused if you hear people talk about Section 22. They are probably also referring to Streamlined Voluntary Conversion. So we'll focus on those two topics today, and that will continue to build more foundation and build more general understanding as we progress through the balance of this training and culminate with trainings that will be coming up next Tuesday and Thursday of next week. So we look forward to seeing you at those as well. So before we get into the specifics of today, we're going to revisit a couple of things that we talked about at our prior session. So we'll be doing one of our knowledge checks, and so we'll click through these quickly just to make sure folks are grounded in the stuff we previously talked about. The first question for the knowledge check today is, what are some of the reasons that a PHA may choose to reposition? So the three fundamental reasons are to stabilize revenue, provide access to debt and equity, which is used to complete needed capital improvements in the property, and reduce administrative burden. So those are the three fundamental reasons that I think both HUD and housing authorities share as a common goal in wanting to reposition public housing. Next one's a true or false. The RAD application process is very difficult, and a housing authority is penalized if their application is approved and they don't convert within 1 year. All aspects of that are false. It's not difficult, and you're not penalized whether it's not converted in a year or ever. So there is no penalty for not converting. HUD has intentionally made the RAD application process an easy barrier to entry. It's intentionally early in the development process. You'll need to have some understanding of what you propose to do. You'll need to have made a decision that you want to convert, that it's something that you fundamentally want to pursue as an option. But you don't have to have all the pieces clearly identified or clearly dialed in. So it's intentionally early so that you can get a spot on the wait list, which again, as of now, there are about 110,000 units available under the $455,000 cap, 455,000 unit cap, pardon me. And HUD encourages folks to get on to that list, lock in your rad rents, and then continue working to see if the project works. So no penalties. And then next question. Under the first component of RAD, properties that are currently funded or public housing may convert their assistance to long-term project-based Section 8 contracts. PBV or PBRA are the two forms of assistance that they may choose from. True. So there are two versions. RAD is the only one of the conversion strategies which allows a housing authority to choose PBRA. There's a couple of other ways that you can convert to PBV, but RAD is the only option that allows for a PBRA conversion. All right, so that was our knowledge check for today. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to start off by talking about what is Section 18. We're going to talk about several of the different ways that you can access the Section 18 process, or some of the justifications for that approval. We'll talk specifically about the Obsolescence Test, which is a big focus of housing authorities who are looking to convert larger, older, more worn out public housing. Then we'll switch or shift into talking about streamlined voluntary conversion. We'll talk about eligibility for streamlined voluntary conversion and the cost benefits as between Section 18 and streamlined voluntary conversion. All right, so let's focus on Section 18 first. So Section 18 is that section of the Housing Act of 1937. It authorizes HUD to approve the demolition or disposition of public housing. The Act has been revised, or this portion of the Act has been revised or evolved over the years. Most recently, in the current rules, so to speak, that HUD and housing authorities operate under for demo dispo are identified in PAH 2018-04. So this is the most current notice that guides HUD and housing authorities interested in this form of Section 18. Generally, HUD will approve Section 18 under a couple of scenarios. First is if the property is physically obsolete. And so physically obsolete is defined. There's a definition of the types of things that you can quantify, and then there's an approach or some definition to how you calculate what the dollar threshold is to define obsolescence. We'll talk about that in a bit. Scattered sites. So if your projects or units are scattered by the definition, then you are eligible for Section 18. If your property is owned by a housing authority with 50 or fewer units, and a little note here, it's 50 or fewer units at the time of your application. So if you start with a number in your portfolio, a number of units larger than 50, and then work your way down to 50 or less, you can then become eligible for the 50 or less. So you don't have to start there. And then the last general category is often shorthanded as efficient and effective operations. With all of these Section 18 approvals, there is an FHEO review that is required to ensure that this shift won't negatively impact folks' access to housing in your community. The Section 18 process is administered by HUD's Special Application Center. So they review, the SAC reviews all demo dispo applications submitted. They also do other things related to eminent domain, home ownership, voluntary conversion, which is also Section 22, and streamlined voluntary conversion. So everything nationwide goes through the SAC. SAC's office is in Chicago, and Jane Hornstein is the SAC director. She's been there a couple of years, and I know from working with her and her staff, they are very focused on helping housing authorities effectively get through a conversion. They've been staffing up, they've been putting out a lot of trainings, they've been working with field office staff to deepen understanding of field office staff's knowledge of these different rules, there's a lot of effort is being put forth by the SAC to help housing authorities with repositioning through Section 18 and streamlined voluntary conversion. A little more background on Section 18. So a significant change in Section 18 occurred in 1998 under QARA. At that time, the amendment that required the one-for-one replacement of public housing units was removed. And so that opened up some flexibility or some options for housing authorities to think about ways in which they could convert their entire public housing portfolio or just a single property for that matter. So that was a big shift. And then in 2012, another notice, significant notice was written that defined Section 18. That notice is focused specifically on obsolescence and still provides some basis for understanding of what obsolescence is. And then now, as I mentioned before, notice 2018-04 expanded the application of Section 18 a little bit and provides some clarity on the rules for processing. So that's a little bit about the history of the current application of Section 18. Section 18 is generally used to do two different things, right? I think about it in two fundamental ways. The first way is to preserve an existing building. If you have a building in your portfolio that you have decided that you want to keep, and we spoke at our last session about the importance of the strategic planning for a repositioning effort. So if you've thought about your portfolios and you've thought about what you want your desired future state to look like, and you've decided that you have buildings that you want to preserve, you want to keep them in your portfolio, you want to continue to have operating subsidy flow to those buildings, and you want to continue to house low-income households. So together, just generally think of that as preserving the building. If that's what you want to do, then Section 18 is a path for that. It's for that outcome. Section 18 also allows you to leverage other capital. So you can leverage low-income housing tax credits, you can leverage debt, you could blend other locally available development subsidies from your city or your county or your state with your property, and you can shift your property to a PBV contract to provide the operating subsidy necessary to achieve affordability, to pay your expenses, and in many cases to leverage some debt as well. So first main thrust of Section 18 is to preserve your property. Second main option or second main branch of the options that are available under Section 18 is one that would have you getting rid of your property. So if you have a building in your portfolio that you've decided is no longer in good shape or no longer well suited to serve as an apartment building for low-income people, Section 18 allows a mechanism to remove that property from your portfolio. The reasons that you may have concluded that the property isn't well suited to be in your portfolio and serving as affordable housing anymore might include the location of the property. It might include the physical condition of the property. Things might have changed over time. You may now find yourself in a flood zone, and you weren't before. So there's a lot of those are changing around the country. You may have found that over the years there's been erosion in that part of your community, and that's negatively impacting your property, and it's just impossible to abate that erosion. It might be that there's just general development pattern changes that now put your building in a spot that is not ideal for residential living. So there's a variety of reasons that could be used or could be considered for not wanting to operate that property as a multifamily apartment building anymore. But this Section 18 allows you a path to convert out of public housing. When you do that, it also provides access to the residents that might still live there now, who will still need an affordable place to live, and you can provide them with a Section 8 voucher to allow them the subsidy needed to successfully move to a new location, or potentially take that subsidy and project base it in another building, which might be part of your development agenda. So again, two fundamental ways that you can think about the application of Section 18. You want to preserve your building, or if you want to remove your building from your portfolio and then find a different way to serve low-income people, either through a voucher program or by project-basing subsidy that comes to you. These next boxes reflect some choices that that the housing authorities have to make. So the first is the method of disposition, and this relates to the next bullet, which is estimate of fair market value. But basically, there's two methods of disposition that occur. First is at fair market value. The second is at less than fair market value with commensurate public benefit. If you sell your property at fair market value, the SAC will look for an appraisal. So it needs to be an MIA appraisal, which you will have ordered or got from an appraiser, which indicates the current market value of your property. If you're going to sell at fair market value, you need to have an appraisal. If you're going to sell at less than fair market value with commensurate public benefit, SAC will accept something that doesn't rise to the level of an MIA appraisal. So things might be a broker's opinion of value, might be what your local tax assessor puts the property value at. So some third-party indication of value that doesn't have to be as robust as an MIA appraisal. There's then information about relocation. So a relocation plan is written. If I remember right, the application includes an indication that represents that you have the relocation plan. SAC may ask for it, so having it in your files available is important. The relocation plan will resemble or reflect what your intent for the building is. So if you have a building that you want to preserve and you're going to TPV, you're going to project base your tenant protection vouchers back in that building, and you're going to spend a little money rehabbing that building, your relocation plan would reflect that. If your plan is to sell the building at fair market value and use tenant protection vouchers to let residents go live somewhere else, your relocation plan would reflect that. So your relocation plan is very situational and needs to support what your justification says and what your overall plan is. Then all of this goes in through PIC. So it is submitted through the PIC site, and that's how it gets into the hands of the folks at the SAC. Justifications. So there's two categories of justifications. One would be justifying the demolition of your property, and one will be justifying disposition of your property. We'll talk in a little bit about the differences and combinations of those two things. So under demolition, you would need to document obsolescence through either physical or location factors, or prove that a de minimis demolition is approvable. So that de minimis would just be math. So it's a function of how many units you have. Obsolescence would take more effort. Under disposition, your justifications again would be around physical obsolescence. So proving that the physical needs of your building currently are so sufficient that it warrants a disposition. That the surrounding area or actually this one is broken into two pieces. Health and safety would be one category, and infeasible operations would be another category. So you would have to prove those two things. Health and safety could be things like you're in a floodplain, you're on a slope, you're near a factory, something that jeopardizes the health and safety of the building. Scattered sites. So here you need to prove that your buildings meet the definition of scattered sites. So that can be done with maps, addresses, and I'll elaborate on the definition in a second. Non-dwelling property. So in some cases, housing authorities want to just dispose of that. Some housing authorities have non-dwelling property that is standalone, not part of a bigger residential community. Sometimes that's an office building. Sometimes that's a job shed or a warehouse of some sort. So there's a particular approach to non-dwelling property if it's standalone. If your non-dwelling property is adjacent and part of your residential property, it's typically just wrapped into that bigger justification and disposition request. Rad and Section 18 repositioning combined, so sometimes called Rad Section 18 blend, more efficient and effective, and then if you have 50 units or less in your inventory. Those are the types of justifications that exist for a Section 18 disposition. So then are you asking for demo, are you asking for dispo, are you asking for both? So it depends upon what you're going to do with the building, what your intended end use for the building is. So if you ask for a demolition-only approval, what you're asking for is the ability to use your public housing money to tear down the buildings that exist. When you do that, the land still remains controlled by the DOT. So HUD will not release the DOT yet. What you're only getting at this point is approval to raise the buildings using public housing money. And presumably you're doing that for a reason. And then later, you'd have to come back and ask for approval that would result in removal of that DOT. So demo approval is just tearing down the building and the property is still encumbered by HUD. Second is disposition. So under disposition, you're selling the property as is. There is a disposition, so it does have to transfer, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So what you're asking for under this request is that you are allowed to transfer ownership of the building to another entity. Upon transfer, HUD releases its DOT. Once that's done, the building can be torn down. So again, depending on what you tend to do and questions around timing. So you can do a disposition only and then have the building raised after the disposition occurs. Last one is the combination of demo and dispo. So here the Housing Authority wants to demolish the property while it is owned by the Housing Authority, while it is controlled by a HUD DOT, and with the use of public housing money. After the building comes down, then the transfer of vacant land would occur. So this is, again, very situational, and so you'd have a situation here where for whatever the reason the Housing Authority, and maybe it's because of a partner or some other factor, needs to tear the building down and then transfer this vacant land to a partner that's going to help you with the development. In my experience, the dispo only is used a lot and allows for the preservation of properties. So therefore gets used a lot in my experience. I'm going to pause there because that was a lot of information. And before we bite off another chunk, Kayla, maybe I'll just give a moment and see if folks have questions yet about the application, about the justifications, about any of the mechanics thus far.
So we have a few. And I guess I just want to see how you want to handle this right now and with time. We have one kind of larger question that I think would be well suited as a case study and that we could maybe save until the end and address it then, or we could just go ahead and do it now, whichever you think.
So let's take on any technical questions right now about the stuff that we've talked about and leave maybe a broader question, because we're going to get through a lot of stuff that will inform a case study.
Yeah, okay. So we do have another one that I think is more technical and a little bit less case study-esque. Once converted through RAD, how can you subdivide excess land from your site? Would you go through Section 18 disposition? Sorry.
So if I understand right, so you converted through RAD, and your property is now a Section 8 property regulated in the RAD construct, and you want to, at that point, you want to make a change in the underlying parcel. And Kayla, maybe you even want to unmute the person that let us chat a little bit about it. But if that is the situation, if you've already converted through RAD, any changes in the structure of your transaction get handled through HUD's office in DC. So any refinancing, any presumably changes in the underlying parcel, any shifts in the land that would be regulated with the RAD, regulatory use agreement, that would go through the HUD DC office and presumably with your local office as well. Most of the time, HUD's local office has attorneys in it that handle the real estate matters that are really a function of state and county issues, and then the policy and program issues are handled out of DC. So if you've already converted through Rad, I think that you want to make some changes in your underlying real estate, you go to the folks in DC. If you anticipate that you want to do this, I think that if you can create any lot partitions before you convert through Rad, I think that would be helpful, and have that happen at the same time. So if you can time it so that your lot partition would be created, and then when you convert to Rad, only the land upon which your Rad property exists would then be encumbered, and you'd share with HUD what you tend to do with the other piece of property, and I imagine they'd have some interest in what that looks like. But you could time it in a way that could help yourself. So, and this one's a little bit unique, or it would be specific to the facts and circumstances of your situation. But if you've already converted through Rad, it's not a Section 18 proposition. It would be going to Rad in DC, pardon me, HUD in DC to talk about changes in the underlying property at that point.
Okay, and then we have Lewis. You're able to be unmuted now if you had anything that you wanted to add.
No, that's great. If you can hear me, that's great. We're in the process of talking to Greg Byrne and that office about this, and they were a little bit confused as well, but I appreciate the information.
I mean, if you step back and think about it for a second, Section 18 is fundamentally about transitioning public housing property to something else. So if you converted through Rad, you are no longer a public housing property. So Section 18 wouldn't necessarily apply. There's going to be some steps that you need to figure out as to how do you do what you're trying to do. So it sounds like maybe split your parcel and do something good with the new parcel you create. But it's technically no longer public housing, and Section 18 is all about transitioning public housing to something else. So Section 18 is not the right window to step up to for that need.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So anything else?
We do have one more question. Yeah, if you wanted to address that one.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. This is a bit of a longer one, and James, I don't know if you would maybe want to unmute your line and expand upon this a little bit, but so we have a total of 36 units, 18 duplexes scattered across 3 separate sites. Oh, he's willing to unmute and just ask it, so I'll do that. So make sure we can dialogue around that. Hi, James, are you there?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
I can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah, it's kind of a timing question. I think you already mentioned this earlier, but we're trying to basically get out of public housing all at one time, do kind of the Rad-O-Matic where we're not doing any financing and doing minimal changes to our assets because they're in decent condition, but we have longer-term prospects for development. So the question is related to Section 18. We've got 3 separate sites that have duplexes in them, total of 36 units. They don't meet the definition of scattered sites for HUD's definition because there's more than, I think it was 4 at each place. Mm-hmm. But we're still trying to do it concurrently. So if we went through and we did Rad and Streamlined Voluntary to get rid of the rest of our 431 units to get down to the 36, then we'd have less than 50 units, so we'd be able to Section 18 those out because that would be all that's left in public housing?
That's right.
Can we do it concurrently? Or do we have to actually have separate times?
So that's a good question. So I'll give you a quick answer, and then this is something to follow up with folks at the SAC on. So
yes,
there have been situations where it makes sense for a housing authority to simultaneously convert multiple properties and at one time. And that if they weren't simultaneously converted at one time, they would then meet like the 50 or less requirement. But because they are being done at a single time, it doesn't look like it meets 50 or less, because you look at the PIC and see how many units you have in your portfolio, and if it's greater than 50, then you don't meet it. But if there is good justification for simultaneously making this conversion happen, and often that is a function of having a single financing execution that is going to be used to support all of this, then HUD has been open to that. This is a topic I'd encourage you to spend some time with your local office, and I think folks at the SAC would be able to give you a good response on your specifics. But I know they've worked with people who are in your shoes, where you're trying to be efficient in what you do, and maybe trying to blend financing in a way that is helpful. And so lay all that out and explain your case to your local staff, your local HUD staff, and to the SAC. But things like that have happened. But
yeah, and that was why we were going to do the call. Once we have a plan that what we're going to do with each of the rest of our sites, then go to them and say, okay, if you boil all this down, we could do it at one time. Does it have to be, and there's going to be separate closes all over the place anyway, but I'd like to do it in 1 week and be done with the pain.
There's something to be said for being as efficient as possible. I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, James.
Thanks. So, Mike, we do have one more. Under Section 18, disposition only, can a PHA sell a scattered site unit to a current qualified PIH renter and still receive a TPV for that unit? And if so, is the Section 18 dispo route better than Section 32 homeownership route?
So, single-family scattered site unit owned by a housing authority, you want to dispose of it and sell it to a low-income family. So I think the short answer, so under that scenario, if it is a scattered site, you could qualify under the scattered site Section 18 justification. If the unit's occupied, you would get a tenant protection voucher for that unit. You would then have to tell HUD what your method of sale is and whether you're selling it at fair market value or less than fair market value. You'd have to get an appraisal, and you'd have to figure out what is the fair market value. Now, if the fair market value also turns out to be a sales price that the family can afford to purchase it at, then you can sell it at fair market value. If it turns out that in order to achieve affordable homeownership, you need to discount the price in some way to make it affordable to that family, you're selling it then at less than fair market value, and the HUD would look for some commensurate public benefit, which is typically an affordability restriction at 80% AMI or less. So that's, I think that is a path. There's a lot that you need to unpack there about what can your buyer afford, what's the income of your buyer, whether they would qualify as someone who meets the commensurate public benefit requirement or not. I have used Section 18 for home ownership before. I've found it to be a little bit easier to work with. It found it to be a little bit easier to support what you're trying to do with an affordable home ownership strategy. So it is, in my judgment, an available and a fine path to use. A lot of things will hinge on what your buyer and what your policies are around home ownership. So think about that. Okay, let's keep moving. Tenant protection vouchers. So if you receive a disposition approval from the SAC, you then become eligible to apply for tenant protection vouchers. It's a separate process. You do that by filling out a form. It's 52515. You submit it to your field office. Folks might be familiar with it. It's a pretty short and straightforward form to complete. So upon receiving your disposition approval letter, you send in that form. Let's see. So I'll just go through these bullets and then just talk generally about sort of how this works. So the housing authority must offer to qualifying families the tenant protection voucher as a relocation resource. So there's something to keep in mind here is that if a family had income that grew while they were living in your public housing and they now exceed the Section 8 requirements, then you've got to talk to that family about what their options are for relocation. But you have to offer to qualifying families. Normal housing choice voucher requirements apply to tenant protection vouchers. A PHA can offer a tenant-based assistance or project-based assistance. So this gets back to the idea of what you're going to do with your building. Are you going to preserve that building and project-based those vouchers in that building, or are the residents going to need to move somewhere else? A housing authority, at the time that you submit your 52515, you are eligible to receive a voucher for any unit that had been occupied in the last 24 months. So that's any unit that was occupied in the last 24 months, which is different than your high water mark of occupancy. So it might be that if you look back over the 24 months, you were only at 95% occupancy. But in that 24 months, maybe every unit had a household living in it, based upon people moving in and moving out. So it's units occupied within the previous 24 months is what you're eligible to apply for. Housing authorities which have a housing choice voucher program are eligible to apply. So if you are a public housing authority and a housing choice voucher housing authority, you can apply for your own tenant protection vouchers. If you're a housing authority that is PH only, in order to use those vouchers, you would need to partner with an existing housing choice voucher housing authority. HUD won't create a new voucher program in order to give a housing authority tenant protection vouchers. So if you don't have a voucher program now, you need to find one in your state or in nearby neighborhood or community that would agree to administer those for you. So this happens often. Sometimes there's a housing authority in the neighboring county that would do it for you. Sometimes states do this, so it's very specific to your location. And then, like all HUD programs, there's appropriation levels and amounts to think about that will determine how many of the tenant protection vouchers are available to housing authorities. Like with anything, appropriations is always a factor. Okay, so these next bunch of slides are going to talk about the definitions or the criteria for Section 18. So obsolescence is the first one. So obsolescence relates to the physical condition of the property. It's a justification for demo or dispo. And the amount of obsolescence is set by, let me say this clearly, the threshold for determining obsolescence is set by HUD annually. It is a function of the type of building that you have. There's some categories I'll show you. The number and bedroom size of units in those buildings, and an index to RS means. So for any building that you have, you can determine what your TDC or HCC is. So the total development cost is a number published by HUD for your community, for your building type, and you can calculate that number pretty easily. When we get through these, I'll show you where to get that. For obsolescence, you need to demonstrate that you have costs which are greater than 57.14% of your TDCs for your building if your building does not have an elevator, or 62.5% of your TDCs if your building has an elevator. So this can grow to be a sizable number. This is an area that requires a lot of planning to support. Typically what happens when a housing authority is looking to justify obsolescence is they will engage with architects or contractors or vendors to complete capital needs assessments to help them quantify the needs of the building. So when you won't find this in the notice or in the regs anywhere, but basically what you're trying to do is determine the cost of the things of building that are broken. This is what you won't see in a notice. There's a difference between something that's broken and something that's just old. So if you come to HUD and say, I've got an old building, it's obsolete, they're not going to approve you. But if you come to them and say, I have an obsolete building, and here are the things in my building which currently need to be fixed, and here's the value of the repairs that are needed, and that the value of those repairs exceed my threshold, then you're obsolete. In order to do that, you need to spend some time really digging into what your building is. And so a way to tackle that is to think about the elements of your building and think about the big systems. So things that I've often done are look at the building skin, so the windows, the siding, the roof. So certainly depending upon where you are in the country, those things can suffer a lot if there's water damage or even sun. So look at the building skin. Do some destructive testing. Take some siding off. Take some pictures. Have some contractors or architects come out and help you understand what's behind that siding that you can't see by just standing on the sidewalk and looking at your building, but probe a little bit and then document all that. Take pictures of it and get someone to cost out for you what is necessary. Look at your building systems, your mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. So have lines scoped. Look at things that are, test your electrical systems. So have someone come in who can pull those apart and take pictures of them, observe them if they're in the wall, and determine if those are obsolete. If you have things in your kitchen that might be old or bathrooms that might be old, and maybe they don't look great, there's some folks at the SAC that like to talk about 1970s colors that might be just really hideous and someone doesn't want to see that anymore. Doesn't mean it's obsolete. But if your drawers are falling apart, so if you can show through maintenance records that you're constantly fixing your cabinet boxes or doors are falling off, then it needs to be repaired, then it's obsolete. So it needs to be broken. A couple of other things to keep in mind that are kind of ancillary to or because of that, or come from the primary work that needs to get done. So if you have to repair or replace plumbing stacks because they're failing and the water distribution throughout your building it's broken. In order to do that, you have to cut into some walls, and to cut into those walls, you need to abate asbestos that might be in, or lead that might be in the paint or in the materials used to tile your bathroom. Your abatement now becomes an eligible cost for calculating obsolescence because you have to do that in order to complete the fix of your plumbing stack. So if there's things that you have to do in order to get to the ultimate fix, like abatement, then that becomes a cost that you can quantify. Second point here is that if there is a requirement that your building department will put on you as a condition of getting your building permit, then those also become costs that are eligible to bring forward for the obsolescence calculation. So in a lot of communities, these public housing buildings are old and they were built under a different code. And when you go into your building department and say, I want to rehab my building, often a building department will look at you and say, hey, that's great, and we see that you're non-conforming with our current code. In order to give you a permit to do the things you want to do, you need to address these non-conforming items. If there are any of those things that your city or building department requires of you, that you must do them in order to get your permit, in order to fix your building, those become costs that you can consider also. So if you think that you can prove obsolescence, it's good to step back and have a good strategy for quantifying what your building's needs are. It usually requires the help of some professionals in the building or design trade, engineers and the like, who can help you with photographs, studies, costs, you put all that together and you work towards supporting a cost to fix your building, which would get you past these threshold requirements, which are set by HUD annually. Let me take a second here to segue. I'm going to share my screen right now and show you where this information lives so that you can know how to find it. So let me just set that aside. So, all right, you should be able to see my screen right now. So what I'm looking at is, this is the SAC landing page on their website. So the Special Application Center, lots of great information in here. Under what we do, towards the very top is the Demo Dispo section. So here you'll find a bunch of stuff about the Housing Act and 24 CFR Report 970 and the 2018-04 notice, all of which describe Section 18. In the center here, you'll see this blue box, which will give you a link to the TDC cost limits by year. So what that takes you to is a PDF of the numbers which HUD publishes annually. They're organized by HUD region. So it starts with Region 1 and goes through, I think there's 10 regions. It then gets organized by state, and then within state by a large metropolitan or just large geographical areas. And then the table gives you a number for bedroom size, and then the TDC number, total development cost, and the HCC, the hard construction cost. So this table is the raw data that is used to calculate TDCs. The other useful tool that I want to share with you is also available on the SAC website. So it's here, the link says HUD's TDC Limit Workbook. So if you click on that, it will download an Excel file. And I'll launch that file, and you'll see this spreadsheet that has quite a few tabs in it. I'm going to go over here to the Select City and State file. So this is the first tab that you would input information in. So I'm going to stick with using Cheyenne as our example. So I put Cheyenne in the city, and I'll put Wyoming in the state, and it will return for me from that data set that I just showed you before what the TDCs are, TDCs, and so here's the TDC amounts, and then the HCCs by bedroom size, by building type. There's four building types: detached, semi-detached, elevator, row house, and walk-up. A walk-up is a building that has a floor, a horizontal separation between units. A row house is a building that has a vertical separation between units. Elevator building has an elevator. And then detached, semi-detached would be single-family house doubles. I think it goes up to 4 units. There's actually on this TDC instruction page is the definition. So if you didn't catch that, the very first tab under TDC instructions, it gives you right here the definition of each of those building types. So you can think about your building and pick the right one. So first thing you do is set your city and your state, and then go to this next tab called Unit Mix. So, folks in Wyoming have a 77-unit building with an elevator that maybe they want to, I'm making this all up. So maybe they want to preserve that building. They want to consider whether it qualifies under Section 18. Now, I don't know the number of units of the bedroom mix in that building, so I have to make this up. So I'm going to assume that they're all 1 bedrooms. So I'm going to put a 77 here under rehab and new construction. And I'll show you why. Actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do 70 under 1 bedrooms and 7 under 2 bedrooms. And I'll show you why. and I put it under rehab and new construction. This next tab called Tvc and Hcc Limits then calculates for me what the aggregate Hcc and Tvc limit is. So it shows me here that I have an elevator building with 71 bedrooms and 7 two-bedrooms. It then pulls from that data that we looked at earlier what the total Hcc is for my 1 bedrooms and my 2 bedrooms, and then adds them up down here. And then for my 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms, and adds them up over here. So here it tells me that this building total development cost number is $24,260,014. So if I multiply that by 62.5%, then I know that my obsolescence threshold is $15.1 million. So if I have a building such as this one, an elevator building with a lot of 1 and 2 bedroom units in it, and I can calculate my TDCs, I now know my target is $15.1 million. I can then reflect on what I know about my building and use my judgment to figure out, am I close to being able to meet that? It might be that you know you are. You might know that your windows leak and that your plumbing stacks are terrible and that your elevator is always breaking down and that, you know, the list goes on. And you might know that you can get there. It might be that your building's in great shape and that there's no way you're going to get close to that, and so it's not even worth the effort. So it comes down to judgment at this point about that is based upon your understanding of your building, what your calculated TDC obsolescence threshold is, whether or not you decide to continue with an obsolescence exploration or not. So you can quickly calculate this for yourselves. One last point, the calculation is performed by building. So if you have a whole portfolio, you'd be doing this building by building. So you could create, you know, this file multiple times for building A, building B, building C, to understand what your threshold amounts are for each of those buildings. And maybe you've got one building that is close, and so Section 18 obsolescence makes all the sense in the world. Maybe you've got another building that you're never going to get there, and so Rad is your best option. So you use this tool building by building to figure out obsolescence. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to the slides. Kayla, are we back looking at the screen? Does that work?
Yep, we're back.
Okay, great. Sticking with obsolescence, but just for demo only, so related to location. So this one is not based upon TDCs, but based upon what's around your property. So is your property in a flood zone? I think we talked on Tuesday about the changing flood zone maps, so keep an eye on those. Maybe you discover that your building is on soil that was contaminated. You know, maybe you discover that the factory next door was making artisan glass and pumping some nasty stuff out, and you didn't know it. And so you need to no longer have a residential occupancy there. Whatever that environmental factor is, you can document that in a way that is more qualitative. It's more about where the building is or the land upon which the building sits. It's not about the physical needs of your building itself. Some other obsolescence factors that relate to not the TDC calculation, but impact or marketability. So is your building, if you no longer have a need for 1 bedrooms in your community? Or do you no longer have a need for 4 bedrooms in your community because maybe your community is getting very old and families are moving out and what's left are a lot of low-income elderly folks. So maybe your bedroom mix doesn't match what your needs are. Related to that, serious impediments to the operations of residential use. That could be an environmental factor, could be market. But some third-party documentation is required. If it's a market factor, you need to be able to show that you've made efforts, and despite those efforts, you still can't lease your units, or show that, document whatever the adverse impact is that's impacting your building. De minimis is similar to what we had talked about under RAD. So if you want to dispose of a small number of your units, lesser of 5 units or 5% of your units throughout your portfolio, you can do that through Section 18 as well. Obsolescence is not required. You do that through your SAC process. An environmental review is required. So again, that's the Part 58. Disposition for health and safety concerns. Again, this is similar to the obsolescence for the environment. So you got conditions in your area that are adversely impacting the residential use, and the housing authority cannot cure or mitigate those cost effectively. So this is not a TDC calculation, but this is, that you can't move the building out of a flood zone cost effectively. You can't solve for any slope or erosion issues cost effectively. You can't address, a factory next door cost effectively. So those are the types of things that you would document. Generally, when that happens, you'd be selling the property at fair market value to a buyer. And for calculating fair market value there might be a little tricky given what the adverse conditions are, but it's typically a fair market value because you're not looking to continue the use of that property as low-income housing, which is the standard practice when you sell it less than fair market value. Infeasible operations, again, we touched on this a bit before. So if there's no demand for your building or your unit type, that might be because of changing demographics in your community. So you need to show that you need to show that. You can support it with market information. You can support it with demographic information, your own wait lists, your historic occupancy of those unit sizes. There's a variety of things that you can show to demonstrate what your efforts have been and that there's lack of demand. Okay, scattered sites. So the definition of scattered sites for Section 18 is a building which has 4 or fewer units, which is sitting on a lot which is not contiguous to another lot. So if you own a bunch of single-family houses that are scattered around neighborhoods in your city, that's a pretty standard scattered site project. Maybe some of those buildings are doubles or triples, and they're scattered all around. That meets the scattered site definition. If you own a 2-acre lot, and on that 2-acre lot are a whole lot of buildings that have 4 units in them, that's not a scattered site. That's a large lot with a lot of low-density buildings on it. It's not scattered site. So often housing authorities will step back and look at their whole portfolio and see that they've got scattered sites, and maybe those scattered sites are even scattered across different amps. And if you're trying to move towards a strategy that would allow you to dispose of your entire portfolio, you can reorganize yourself so that you can take all your scattered sites off and that meet the definition, and that becomes an easy Section 18 application. You get tenant protection vouchers, and then you can, at that point, you can either choose that you're going to keep those in your portfolio after a disposition and project-base those new tenant protection vouchers and continue to operate them as rental, or maybe you choose to sell them and you help the family relocate with a tenant protection voucher. The building has no debt on it, so you sell it. You use that cash for an eligible use, which is generally furthering your affordable housing goals. And likely or often housing authorities use that cash to create new multifamily or more efficient affordable housing properties. So that's scattered site. Another justification is very small housing authorities, so 50 or fewer units. With the 50 or fewer unit justification comes mandatory closeout. Pardon me. We'll talk more about closeout in the next week, but this is sometimes used as the last option. So again, if you got a big portfolio or portfolio at least bigger than 250, and you incrementally work your way down to 50, you can then use this as your last option. So it might be this is a 36-unit building that's in okay condition. Doesn't meet your obsolescence test because it's in good shape. Your RAD rents are less than FMRs, so you could save this one as last, do Section 1850 or less, get tenant protection vouchers and preserve that building and continue to operate it within your portfolio. This last one is the Rad Section 18 blend, or sometimes you'll see it written as 7525. So the idea here is that you're blending a Rad approval with a Section 18 approval in order to boost your revenue, in order to attract more debt than you could otherwise, which allows you to achieve greater capital improvements by having increased your borrowing capacity. So the way this one works is that a housing authority would apply to RAD. So you start this process with a RAD application. You get a CHAP. You then discover that, well, your needs are, your physical needs as determined by your ECNA are a little bit more than you can get to with just 100% RAD revenue. And if you had a little bit more net operating income, so a little bit more revenue, you could borrow a little bit more money and you could address those needs. So what HUD has done is say, well, in those situations, we'll let a housing authority say, I'm going to take this property and 75% of my units in this property will go RAD and 25% in the units in this property will go Section 18. Those 25% will get a tenant protection voucher. So the revenue for those 25% will be based upon your FMRs. The revenue for the 75% will be based upon your RAD rents, thus allowing you to borrow a little bit more money. So in order to be eligible for this, you also have to show that your construction cost for that project is at or greater than 60% of your HCC amount. So if you think back to the tool that I showed you before and the PDF I showed you before, for this building, you can calculate your HCC the same way that I showed you for that building in Wyoming. You put in you determine what type of building it is, you put in the unit mix, put the unit count under rehab and new construction to return both your TDC and your HCC numbers, and you'll get your HCC aggregate amount for that building. Take 60% of that, and that becomes your target. So if your construction budget for your repositioning is at or greater than that number, you can then avail yourself of the 7525 Rad Section 18 blend. This option is also only available, well, let me say it this way, is not available if you use 9% low-income housing tax credits. It is available if you use 4% credits, or it is available if you don't use any credits, but just use debt, or subordinate debt or conventional debt. But it's not allowed for when using the 9% low-income housing tax credit. The policy reason behind that decision was that HUD recognizes that the 9% credit is scarce, and that if a project has a significant rehab need and it can't quite get there with 100% RAD units and 4% credits, maybe it could get there with a 75% RAD, 25% fair market rents, and 4% credits. So it clears the path for those types of projects and takes away some of the burden on the 9% Q in your state. So the policy reason behind that was to try to alleviate some of the pressure on the 9% credit and make 4% deals more viable by allowing for a boost in revenue on those transactions. The slide here gives an example of this 100-unit project, which basically follows what I'd explained. 100-unit project, the HCC limit is $160,000 per unit, making the minimum construction amount of, so 60% being $96,000 per unit. Under this scenario, 75 units would go RAD, 25 Section 8 TPVs. Here they're using 4% credits and private financing, but not 9% credits. And then the last is the Rad Section 18 blend closeout. So under this scenario, if your housing authority if your housing authority has a property that and it wants to convert as your last property. So if that property is 50 units or less, then it would convert, it can convert through the Rad Section 18 blend, which is basically a way to interface with HUD using the Rad procedures and utilize the Section 18 50 or less result with a twist. So and the example shows this. So here, your last building might be greater than 50 units. So if your last building has, you pick a number. The example here shows 70. So if your last building has 70 units, you can use the Rad Section 18 blend closeout. You would go through the Rad interface. You'd get a chap. You would go through those steps. You would then, under this scenario, convert 20 units through Rad and 50 units through the Rad, through the Section 18 50 or less. So it's this idea of using the Section 18 50 or less that can exist by itself. But if you have more than 50 units, you can then combine that through the Rad interface and have a project that would have a blended subsidy mix. So as you're thinking about what might be your last building and how do you take advantage of that 50 or less, if you don't have any buildings that are 50 or less, but you've got one that's 65 units or 70 units, you can still take advantage of the 50 or less economics and Rad in much the same way. I'm going to stop there as well, Kayla, because I think there's a lot behind those different options and the definitions, and see if folks have any questions.
Yeah, so a few that came in while you were talking. One specifically, a question about slide 23, if you wanted to go back. 5% of all units or all ACC units?
Slide 23. Is that, my slide 23 doesn't on it. Could you read me the question? My slide 23 shows disposition, the disposition definition.
Okay, my slide 23 shows 5-year period, lesser of 5 units or 5% of units PHA wide. Here, I'll go back.
Oh, that's your ACC units. So that's the de minimis definition. That's your ACC unit. So if the housing authority has other units that it owns in its portfolio that are not on your ACC, that definition is just focused on your ACC.
Great. We have another question from someone who wants to unmute their line. So let me unmute him really quick. James, are you there?
Yeah. This was just another question. You were talking about being able to make, because properties are sitting in a flood zone, make them obsolete. But if we want to not make them necessarily obsolete and go through one of these repositioning strategies because it's protected by a levee and it's not a floodway, is there any problem with any of the programs with doing that?
So this.
So it's a flood zone and it's protected, so we can get insurance for it and all that. So I don't think there's a problem with any financing at some future date or during the process, but don't know how HUD would feel about, these going in and being, a Section 8 property of some sort.
Yeah, so this gets pretty technical, and so what my understanding of these things are is that the most dire of the flood categorizations that can exist that would prohibit the use of public resources supporting that property. And so what I don't know is how any sort of flood control mechanism like a levee impacts that. I would, if I were in your shoes, I think I would dig into that a little bit more offline here. My sense is that if you're receiving subsidy now and that would be an indication that things are okay. I think what I've seen happen is that these, and I think it's called the floodway, which is the most dire of these determinations, as that line moves and then all of a sudden it encroaches on an existing property and there is no, there is no levy or what have you, that's when the problems exist. So my sense is that you're okay, but I'm not an expert on this flood stuff.
Okay, yeah, we just want to make sure it doesn't get worse. We're already getting the subsidy, it's never flooded, but there's levees right there.
Sure.
So
right.
If they breach, then yeah, you have a problem.
Yeah. But I think it should be okay.
Thanks. Okay.
Okay, Mike, I have another participant who I'm going to unmute their line so they can ask their question.
Hello, hi, Mike.
Angela. Hi.
Hi. So I'm a little confused between the Rad Section 18 blend and maybe the information on the resource desk. I didn't understand it correctly, but we have a 110-unit property that we would like to convert. There's no construction that will be needed. The residents will be staying in place, no relocation. We had thought that we would be able to have the RAD for like 75% of our units, and then we would Section 18 the remaining 25% units. Is that, from listening to what you're saying, that doesn't sound like we're able to do that.
That's correct. So under your scenario, let me just quickly do something.
So it has to have construction involved in order to be eligible for the Section 18?
Yeah, so you're actually, I think, in a better situation with the RAD Section 18 closeout. So there's two versions, I guess, of a RAD Section 18 blend. One is, let's call it 75-25. Under the 75-25 scenario, 75% of the units go RAD, 25% go TPV, project-based vouchers. So for you, that would be 83 units going RAD and 27 units going TPV. In order to avail yourself of that option, you would need to show that your construction costs for your project will hit 60% of your HCC. Sounds like you don't think that's going to happen because your building's in good shape.
Correct.
If your building is your last building, so is this your last building?
No.
Okay. So if it were your last building, you could do the RAD Section 18 closeout, which would allow you to have 50 units go RAD Section 18, 50 or less, so that means 50 units get TPVs, and then 60 units, the balance, would go RAD. The economics of that would, assuming that your RAD rents, assuming that your FMRs are greater than your RAD rents, having this greater percentage of nearly 50%, slightly less than 50%, go TPVs would produce better economics for you than under the 75-25 blend. But in order to take advantage of that, it needs to be your last building, because the RAD Section 18, 50 or less closeout is a mandatory closeout, which means it has to go last. So if you're able to position yourself so that it is last, I mean, you could do that building, have better revenue, and not have to spend 60% on a construction budget.
I think what we're doing is we want to RAD this particular property, and then we'll be under the 250 units to be able to do the streamlined voluntary conversion. So, all right. Well,
you have a couple of options.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Kayla, anything else?
I don't see anything else right now. I'm still looking to see if there are any hands up. I'm not seeing anything, so you're good to go.
Okay. Okay. So the next slide talks about this justification that's sometimes shorthanded as efficient and effective. So efficient and effective is a particular aspect of the code. It's talked about in the notice 2018-04, and the notice and the code will elaborate on the kinds of things behind this. But what it boils down to is the housing authority has decided that they've got a better idea of how they should be housing people, and it's better than what this building is. You don't have to prove obsolescence. You don't have to prove you're in a floodway. It's just that you basically are done with this building being Section 9, and you're going to convert to something else. Now, to do that, you have to fill out you got to go through all the application steps that we talked about before on those boxes that were in the 3 different rows that started with the HUD form and ended with the PIC submission. So you still have to do all of that. You still have to do the mayor's letter and the Part 58, and is it going to be fair market or less than fair market value with commensurate public benefit? You have to do all that. The big difference here is, though, that the housing authority will only receive TPVs for 25% of the occupied units. So that might be an okay thing, depending upon what your strategy is. It might be that you can't figure out how to make a plan work with only a fraction of the TPVs that you might otherwise need. So efficient and effective is available to housing authorities. It's a version of the Section 18 approach. It's technically defined further under 970.17b and also elaborated in the code, but it's limited by only getting 25% vouchers. Okay. Keep going here. So non-dwelling property, I mentioned this earlier. Sometimes housing authorities have a piece of real estate that is non-residential or non-dwelling property, and you want to get rid of it. There's this particular process to do that, or you can roll it into your a residential Section 18 application if it's part and parcel to that application. If you're working yourself towards closeout, and so if you've got a central office building or some other piece of real estate that is not a residential building, and it is encumbered by a DOT, which most of them are because they were purchased or paid for with public housing money, and you're working towards closeout, you have to keep this one in mind, and you'd have to find a way to get that property into a Section 18 application. So it either gets wrapped into an existing building or it's a standalone application. So those are pretty straightforward. You have to justify that you no longer need that real estate to operate your public housing operations. So it's a technical thing and just something to keep in mind, largely if you're trying to dispose of the entire portfolio. All right, so we keep talking about disposition. And so you might be wondering, well, who are we disposing to? So under Section 18, a housing authority must transfer title to a separate legal entity under the state law. So most housing authorities are public corporations within your state. You must transfer title to a different entity. So that PHA can still be involved in the ownership or control of that property. So a separate legal entity in your state might be a limited partnership, and your state might allow public corporations to create limited partnerships. So your housing authority could create a single member LLC. The housing authority is that single member. It is technically a separate legal entity under state law. The housing authority can then sell that property to that new legal entity, which is wholly controlled by the housing authority, yet still separate. That meets the definition for a separate legal entity, and then would allow the housing authority to transfer title. And again, we talked about this before, the transfer would have to be either at fair market value or at less than fair market value with commensurate public benefit. If you're going to preserve the building, the less than fair market value part is often nominal. It's often it can be $100. What's important there going forward for HUD is that the commensurate public benefit is the affordability. So must be a transfer to a separate legal entity. PHAs can still own or control that entity. There's some things to think about here in your state, so a couple things to flag. Different states speak differently to public corporations' ability to participate in partnerships. So take a look at that. Usually that's found in the enabling legislation for housing authorities in your state, whether or not you're allowed to do such a thing. Think about the implication on property taxes or pilot. So in some states say that anything owned by a housing authority is statutorily exempt from paying property taxes. Some states say that anything owned by a housing authority or owned by another entity that a housing authority is part of is also exempt. You don't want to find out the hard way that when you transfer title, you somehow lose your property tax exemption. Depending upon what your pilot agreements say, there might be some implications on your pilot agreements as well. So take a look at those. Often pilot agreements there's the letter of the agreement, and then there's the ongoing relationship between the city, county, and or the housing authority about how much is being paid and where that money goes. And so something to think about there as well. If it's technically no longer public housing, what does that mean for a pilot agreement? The entity also may be a corporation. So housing authorities can create corporations. So your board can create another entity that it could be a nonprofit. It doesn't have to be a nonprofit, but a corporation is a separate entity that is governed by that board. So this gets to some questions around control. Corporations function by actions of boards. Partnerships function by actions of the controlling entity. So there's some differences there to keep in mind if you're thinking about what the kind of future governance and control of the property looks like. Again, we talked about the differences between fair market value and less than fair market value. There can also be a ground lease. Sometimes with preservation projects, and this is actually common, this is how I do most of the ones I work on, that a housing authority owns a traditional public housing building. The housing authority owns the land, the housing authority owns the building. The housing authority will sell the building to a limited partnership at less than fair market value, and it will retain ownership of the land, and it will sign a ground lease with the ownership of the building to allow the building's owner to sit on the housing authority's land. That's a pretty common structure, pretty common when low-income housing tax credits are used. And there's some reasons that that's helpful to a housing authority. And it kind of enhances the idea of control and oversight and in the event things 50 years down the road go differently. So ground leases are also pretty common. Commensurate public benefit. So it's required again when the disposition is at less than fair market value. It's determined case by case. It is for a residential property. It is typically 80% at AMI for 30 years. So that is HUD's baseline. My suggestion to you is if you're pursuing a Section 18 disposition and you're going to use credits or use some other type of financing that might have a lower affordability requirement, like tax credits are at 60%, to still present to HUD an 80% regulatory use agreement. HUD will accept it, it's allowable, and the reason for doing that is if you dial your restriction in with HUD and say, HUD, I want some units at 45% AMI and some units at 50% AMI and some units at 60% AMI, if you do that and something changes down the road, you technically have to then go back to the SAC and say, hey, when I said that I was going to have units at 45%, well, that changed. I now am going to push those to 50% AMI. HUD will be okay with 50% AMI because it's less than 80. So to alleviate yourself from having to double back if things change a little bit, again, set that broad tent. So same idea before about writing your annual plan to include RAD and Section 18 and Section 22. Same idea about completing your Part 58 to include lease up. If you do things that anticipate what you might be able to do and it's allowable under rules, it can cut down any hassle that you might create for yourself when things shift on you a little bit as you're working your project. Non-residential buildings sometimes have a really tailored use agreement. So that might be things about serving low-income people, serving low-income communities. So those get written ad hoc if it's a non-residential building. What HUD does not accept are things like it'll be a park, or it'll be some sort of great public thing that's not affordable housing. Well, that technically might be public benefit in someone's eyes. In HUD's eyes, public benefit means affordable housing. So your restrictions, your commensurate public benefit needs to be tied to serving low-income people, either through a house or if it's a non-residential building through services. Valuation, again, if it's going to be FMR, then you do need an appraisal. If it is not going to be FMR but less than fair market value with commensurate public benefit, some alternatives will be accepted. Different communities, different cities, you can access stuff easier than others. So, and how do we work with you on what's available to you as well. So keep that in mind. Proceeds. So eligible uses of proceeds, whether it would be at fair market value or less than fair market value. Relocation and reasonable costs for clothing. Modernization of development of public housing, so kind of functioning like your CAP funds. Operations of public housing, functioning like your OPSUP. A RAD project, or RAD-related costs. So again, RAD is the only type of conversion that allows Section 9 money. So the sale of a public housing building in HUD's eyes is seen as Section 9 type money. You could spend it on a RAD project. Or modernization of or development of a PBV unit, or Section 8 shortages. So you can go to the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So those are all eligible uses. The use of the money will be part of the conversation that you would likely have with HUD. It's likely part of your application. So HUD will want to know the terms. So if when you submit your justification and your explanation of your project to them, you'll lay out the salient business terms between the buyer and the seller. And then that conversation or that information will turn into a conversation about where that money is going to go, how it's going to come to you. Does it come in a lump sum? Does it come over time? And HUD is working towards more consistently using this general depository agreement as a way to make sure that proceeds get used in eligible ways. All right. Actually, in that regard, this is one of these areas that is evolving as more and more of these public housing properties are being disposed of, and there's many more situations that housing authorities are coming up with. HUD is working on some guidance around this, and it is available on their site. And I think next time I share my screen, I'll pull that up so you can see the link. But and maybe I'll even send another email like we did yesterday to folks with that link. So there's some guidance available that goes a little bit deeper in this regard. Something important to keep in mind as you're thinking about the plan for future use. Resident consultation. So again, this is an element of the application. So you have to have these meetings before you send the application. And I guess resident consultation could take two forms. One is the resident-specific meeting, and then the resident's participation in your annual plan. So the expectation is that people are aware of what you're doing. They're aware of the plan. So generally, the discussion of your annual plan will talk about what you're doing with your portfolio. And then typically the resident meetings are really more specific about the residents, and residents will ask questions like, do I have to move? Am I going to lose my housing? Is my rent going to change? So it gets very personal, as folks have probably experienced when you have these resident meetings. And folks want to know what it's going to mean for them. There's both kind of broad policy implication and then very specific implication. Section 18, relocation under Section 18 is governed by CFR Part 970. It is not URA by itself. What the CFR says in this regard sounds a lot like URA with some notable differences. And then if you do layer other money into your property, so home money or block rent money, then URA might get triggered. But by itself, Section 18 doesn't trigger URA. So keep that in mind. There are notice requirements, help with finding other available housing requirements, and things like that. And the big difference is that there's no replacement housing factor under CFR 970, but there is under URA. And that can be a big number if it's triggered. Comparable housing resources. So again, keeping in mind relocation, if folks have to move. Public housing offsite is an option if you've got room in your portfolio. Current project-based voucher units elsewhere, either that you control or maybe that someone else controls, but you're the HAP contract holder. Tenant-based voucher assistance to helping families move into the private market, or occupancy in units operated by a nonprofit or someone else. Keep in mind here the income requirements of Section 8 if folks are moving with their tenant protection voucher, so they do have to be eligible for that tenant protection voucher. Public housing, only housing authorities. We touched on this a little bit earlier. So you are eligible to apply under Section 18, because Section 18, again, is the process for those that own public housing to dispose of it. If you don't have a housing choice voucher program, you then have to find one. So you work with your HUD office. Maybe you just know through your working relationships with your colleagues, another housing authority that you think would do this. And your field office staff can help as well. So this happens a lot in some rural states where the next housing authority isn't that close, or western rural areas where the next housing authority is not that close. The HUD staff can help find an option for you. Impact on public housing funds. So this is something to keep in mind and something that is changing. And the slide actually reflects some changes that HUD is publishing today. And so I want to spend a second here to make sure that folks get this. So the guidance from HUD says that housing authorities can only spend cap funds for modernization activities on a project prior to submitting your Section 18 application. So once you submit your Section 18 application, it sounds like the expectation is that your cap funds no longer go to that property. You may continue to spend op funds on maintenance or operations on that property until the property is no longer public housing. So when it's removed from the RMI and PIC, that's the event when it is no longer public housing. So you continue to maintain your property, but the large cap fund modernization expenditures under some HUD guidance that is new is saying that that's not eligible. The operating fund phases for ARF change is, so ARF is now triggered when relocation starts. So relocation starts in this regard when you go into the PIC system and trigger that relocation has begun. And that practically what that could mean is at the event of a closing for a preservation deal and you've entered into a new HAP contract, that would be your relocation. Or if it's folks leaving the building and taking their housing choice voucher and going somewhere else. DDTF, which is the cap fund wind down money, is triggered when the RMI status and PIC is changed as well. And then it comes into effect in the next fiscal year, in the next cap grant year. So it's So that's how the wind down of the impact of public housing funds works under Section 18. So what happens after you submit your application and you get it approved? So the Housing Authority is responsible for updating the field office on the use of OP funds. The Housing Authority would apply for your tenant protection vouchers. The Housing Authority prepares the release of the DOT. This is typically done with some back and forth with the local, there's usually OGC or Office of General Counsel staff in field offices that handle this along with your PIH staff. My experience is that gets done locally. There's a use agreement prepared. There's that the use agreement and the depository agreement that we talked about for the use of proceeds. There's an expectation that the Housing Authority will make the PIC removal request within 7 days of your demo dispo. Your dispo approval letter or your demo approval letter might have some specific conditions in it, depending upon what your game plan is. You might say to HUD, here's my big game plan, this is what I want to do, and HUD might say, that sounds great, and here are some things that we're going to build in as conditions to make sure that things go the way that we all want them to go. So it's the Housing Authority's responsibility to keep up with those conditions and satisfy those conditions. It's also, I think, both required and just good practice to let your field office know how things are going. And if your project changes in some material way, that's okay. That happens a lot, and it doesn't necessarily reflect badly upon anybody. But you need to circle back and request any modification to your dispo approval letter based upon any material changes that might have occurred in the economics or in what your new project is or what have you. So keep that in mind. Your field office will process your TPV application. They'll work with you to find a housing choice voucher Housing Authority if you are not one. Again, they manage the other side of the release of the DOT. They manage the other side of the PIC system, and they'll provide you with support along the way. So there's delineation of roles and responsibilities there. This slide gives a nice collection of the relevant sections of the code, notices, forms that relate to the stuff we're talking about today. So it's nice to check these out. There are also the links that come up when you go to the repositioning website. So it's there's several ways to get to that information. Again, there's the SAC, the HUD SAC site is there, which we looked at earlier when I was sharing my screen. All right, so let's do a quick knowledge check and then take a 5-minute break. So, Kayla, why don't we go ahead and queue these up?
Okay. What Section 18 provision supports small PHAs? Let me find it. Okay. I have to give myself the control back. Okay, it should be open and on people's screens now.
So we changed this one to true or false. So the 50 and under provision supports small public housing authorities under Section 18. All right, so that one was true, and so the multiple choice answer would be it's 50 or under. So again, you can work towards that number, so you don't have to start there. If you work your way there based upon other transactions, that is also acceptable.
Okay.
True or false? Oh, was that me or you?
There we go.
True or false? When converting to Section 18 or Section 22, Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, PHAs are eligible for replacement tenant protection vouchers for units occupied within the last 24 months. So TPV eligibility is prior 24 months.
Okay, we'll give folks a few more seconds to answer that one.
All right, so the answer to that one is true. Oh, pardon me. When converting, that should be true. Why does that slide say that? Trick question. When converting Section 18 or that's true.
Okay.
Well, PHAs are eligible for replacement vouchers for occupied units within the previous 24 months. So apologies for that. And again, it's by unit, so it's not occupancy. It's not occupancy rate. It's units occupied within the last 24 months. So you could have an occupancy rate of 95% over the last 24 months and still have had a household in every unit. That's an important distinction to keep in mind.
Okay, next one.
And to whom may a PHA dispose of a public housing property? This one's multiple choice. All right, it's a separate legal entity. So a PHA may not retain ownership or control through a disposition. As the PHA, they may retain ownership or control. It may be a nonprofit of the PHA. So it's kind of a trick question. This one would have been all of the above. It has to transfer. And true or false, Section 18 allows for demolition to begin before relocation. Section 18 allows for relocation to begin allows demolition to begin before relocation. That one's kind of a silly question. It does not. So you should always complete the relocation before you commence your demolition.
Okay. So we do have a few questions, Mike, if you wanna tackle those right now.
Yeah, let's do those, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and summarize the takeaways and get into the next section.
Okay. I am going to unmute someone's line for you, Anthony. I will let you know when you're unmuted. Anthony, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. We manage, or I manage 2 small agencies now. So I'm the ED at one housing authority, and we have a management agreement for the other housing authority. Both are small agencies. We're looking at converting both to PBRA because we don't have a voucher program. But in the midst of it, we're looking at closing to consolidate the agencies together, likely into either a regional housing authority or a nonprofit housing or a nonprofit agency. Are there any, or does your team there know of any benefits of going either way with those when we do that consolidation at closing?
And when you say either way, what are the
whether it be in how we set up to be either be like a regional housing authority or going towards a nonprofit format?
So that's a big question, and what my guidance to you on that would be to first start with understanding the benefits that exist in your state when you are a housing authority as compared to being a corporation or a nonprofit corporation. A lot of housing authorities a lot of states afford housing authorities benefits, things like property tax exemption, issuing bonds. There's a variety of things that are a benefit to being a housing authority. So if you might want to consider what those are and then consider whether those are worth preserving moving forward. Your housing authorities presumably could consolidate or maybe just thinking out loud, if one of them goes away and the other one changes their geography. So your housing authorities could revise their bylaws and change the footprint of your service area so you could capture the geography that you're wanting. There's often a lot of HR issues involved with this decision. So your state may think one way about public employees, and if you are a housing authority, you're a public employee. If you're a nonprofit, you're not a public employee. So think about what that might mean for your for any HR matters that you'd have to think about. But there's a number of things to consider here. If you want to get out of the public housing business and you don't have a housing choice voucher program, PBRA would be your primary route to consider, unless you can find someone to administer a Section 8 program for you. And so if I were in your shoes, I'd spend a little bit of time asking myself whether that option exists and whether I've got some of these other Section 18 options or not. Then PBRA is my only route. And then what does the new entity look like? And I go back to the idea of thinking about your strategy. What is it you want to look like in I don't know, in 7 years? In 7 years, what do you want your organization to look like? I could imagine there's a whole lot of governance questions and control questions that would come up if you're talking about consolidating organizations. So there's a lot there that goes beyond just the mechanics of a HUD disposition or a Rad conversion. But I think you should dig into what the particulars of your state are to know whether a housing authority entity is preferable over a nonprofit entity.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, but do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we have one more that we can get to before a little break. This person doesn't have a mic on their computer, but okay, so the question is, I have an amp that is obsolete and we will probably sell. The amp operates at a loss and owes the COCC quite a bit of money. If I sell the building to a commercial developer, can I use the proceeds to repay the loan to the COCC? Is that better? This property qualifies for Section 18.
So if to the point about use of proceeds, so using the proceeds for the central office is eligible. Now, whether you can, going forward, whether you can sell I'd also ask myself, could I get fair market value for selling an obsolete building, or would it have to be at less than fair market value if it's going to be an affordable housing project moving forward? So there's some considerations there. When we come back from the break, I will share with folks the link to the guidance that I had mentioned that has a little bit more on uses of funds, so that the person with the question can dig into that detail on their own and figure out how it applies to their situation.
Okay, great, thanks.
Do we have any other questions?
That's all for now, yeah.
Okay, so let's see. It is, by my clock, 5 minutes to the top of the hour. Why don't we come back at the top of the hour and resume with, I'll share my screen, touch on a couple things, end with the key takeaways for Section 18, and then get into Streamlined voluntary conversion.
Okay, see you in 5.
Okay. Okay, we are back. A minute after the hour, so a bit later than I had said. Let me start by sharing my screen once again and let folks know where they can find this guidance that I had mentioned. Actually, Kayla, I think that you need to pass me the ball in order for me to do that.
Oh, you're right,
Just wondering why it wasn't.
There we go, it's passing over.
Thank you. All right, so this is the recently released guidance from the SAC on the use of Section 18 proceeds. The string is up here. I think what I'll do to make it easy on folks is I'll just push this string to everyone so that you have it. It's on the SAC website as well, so I'm sure you could find it pretty easily there. But it lays out for you the potential or the use of proceeds under various examples. So it's new. It's pretty clear. It does a good job of laying out some of the most basic or common, I should say, uses and what the do's and don'ts are. So take a look at that. All right. Couple of takeaways from our Section 18 conversation, rather, and then we'll segue into Section 22, and then that'll be a wrap. So first takeaway is, what do you want to do? This goes back to the idea of understanding what your intent is for that building or what your goals are for that building, and understanding then how Section 18 might help you get there. So is your goal to preserve that building, which is in my mind, one of the two fundamental things that you can do with Section 18. You either preserve that building by showing that it's obsolete or your portfolio is small enough, and then you TPV, turn all those units into TPVs and continue to run it as an affordable property. Or you decide that you don't want that building in your portfolio any longer for what might be one of a variety of different reasons, and that you're going to then use those proceeds to do something else that is eligible. Again, consult the use of Section 8 proceeds guidance. So it's understand what you want from that building, and then figure out how best to apply potentially a Section 18 approach. Transfer is required when you use Section 18, but you do not lose control. So this is really important to get your heads around this difference between the housing authority as an entity that has fee interest in the property versus an entity the housing authority creates. It doesn't mean that you have to give up control. It doesn't mean you stop being the landlord. So you can still exercise all of the control that you currently have and transfer the property. And then the future affordable housing, HUD's interest here through all of Section 18, and we'll see this in Section 22 as well. HUD's focus is on benefit. So what is the benefit? And if the property is sold at fair market value, kind of the shorthand, the way I think about it is that the benefit that HUD sees going to the public is getting paid, in this case in the form of the housing authority, is getting paid a fair market value for that real estate. And then those proceeds are controlled by HUD's guidance for future use. So that's one form of public benefit. It's paid a fair price for its real estate. The other form of public benefit is that HUD ensures that there's a low-income use of that property going forward. And HUD's defined that as 80% AMI or less for a period of 30 years. We'll talk a little bit probably in this next section about how that can even be negotiated where there's a vast majority of the units are affordable and maybe some are treated differently. It's very situational, but public benefit is in the form of affordability. So those are some key takeaways for Section 18. And then some key aspects that we talked about of the application process. It's a very different application than RAD. And just by its nature, by what is required in this application, you're typically further down the development process. Whereas RAD has intentionally a low barrier to entry that allows you to put forward an application in a pretty short period of time. Literally, you can fill the application out in an afternoon. Section 18, based upon everything that is required in this application, will take you more time and more thought. You need to think through what the intended use is going to be, what some of the economics look like, complete your Part 58, consult with your mayor or the executive in charge of your jurisdiction, order an appraisal or otherwise figure out what the value of your property is, describe the use of proceeds. All of that will require more time and thought. So it occurs much later in your development process. So it will require more time. And the SAC is, and just in fairness, so you know, the SAC has a lot of these applications coming to them, and they are doing their very best to respond to them quickly and thoroughly. So if applications come in and they're not complete, they'll let you know it's not complete and ask you to finish it up and send it back in. So they don't want to sit on half of an application or even 75% of an application and just have that on their desk. So I've seen them be professional and direct with housing authorities, letting them know whether something's ready to be reviewed or not. So just keep that in mind. All right, Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, or SVC, or Section 22. So Streamlined Voluntary Conversion allows small housing authorities to convert their inventory to vouchers and then close out their ACC. So this is a really important distinction between RAD and Section 18. So you're converting all of your remaining inventory to vouchers. So to be eligible, you have 250 units or less in your portfolio. And again, you can work your way there, so you don't have to start there. You can work your way there if you started it with a greater number through a prior conversion. Public housing, only housing authorities can partner with another HCD provider is eligible to serve that jurisdiction. So this is important given what the fundamental nature of a streamlined voluntary conversion is. It's converting your Section 8 into a housing choice voucher. It's all of your units, so it's, again, mandatory closeout is required with this, and we'll talk next week about the options for closeout and what that means for any other available public housing asset. Some of the threshold requirements that you need to think about and include in your submission to the SAC. You need to describe how the conversion benefits residents and the public housing community. You need to describe how the conversion will have no adverse impact on access to affordable housing in your community. But given the nature of shifting from a project-based subsidy that is tied to your real estate, which has a particular set of access requirements and threshold review requirements, shifting from that to the Housing Choice Voucher Program could change the implications for people accessing housing in your community. So HUD's going to ask some questions about that, wanting to make sure that no one is shut out, basically, of housing because of the shift. Your conversion plan should demonstrate the proposed future use of the property that had been your public housing, location of the property and mobility options for families, availability of housing for the Housing Choice Voucher assistance. So this could be things like how many landlords participate in your Housing Choice Voucher program, what's the success rate of folks finding housing with a Housing Choice Voucher, what's the breakdown of ownership versus rental in your community. So just general information around ability of a Housing Choice Voucher holder to access housing. The streamlined voluntary conversion, just by its nature, is more focused on the resident than on the real estate. Whereas Section 18 is a little bit more, and RAD are more focused on on threshold criteria and demonstrating things about the real estate, Section 22, Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, is a little bit more focused on the resident. So when you submit your application, your conversion plan should have, and through this process will continue to have significant participation by residents. So we'll talk a little bit about what standing residents have, both in the front-end conversation prior to submitting the application, and then what it looks like for the housing authorities to consult with residents as they go through this process. There's a civil rights review by FHEO. The resident mobility is given to the residents. So residents are given the option of a housing choice voucher assistance. So they get that voucher first, rather than it first going to the housing authority, who then would project base it. The right or the benefit goes directly to the resident to get a housing choice voucher. And then the right to remain in that housing also is given to the resident. So if you own a building that you are considering streamlined voluntary conversion on, and it's fully occupied, those residents in that building would be given the right to have a housing choice voucher and given the right to use that housing choice voucher to continue to live in that unit or that building that they're currently living in. Under streamlined voluntary conversion, the concept of relocation and comparable housing is also defined by code. So this is in 24 CFR Part 972, so a little bit different than what Section 18 was. But also, like Section 18, URA generally does not apply. The housing authority here, though, does pay for moving costs. So if there is a cost related to moving out of the building, that's something that the code requires of the housing authority. Comparable housing resources need to be offered if a resident is going to be moving. So they get their tenant-based voucher, so they get a housing choice voucher. And so they can take that and live in the current or off-site units, or in units occupied by or owned by the housing authority, owned by another owner. The idea of a project-based voucher unit is listed here. I paused to think about that for a second. Well, technically an option. That is a relocation destination for a resident. But if a resident were to move into a PBV unit, they would relinquish their housing choice voucher by doing that. So while it is technically an option for them as a destination, doing so would mean that they would no longer be a housing choice voucher recipient. They'd be a resident in a PBV unit. So there's an important distinction there for folks to keep in mind. So if you own a building and you want to pursue this, and consideration needs to be given to the future use of the property and discussed in your application submitted to HUD. So a couple of big things to think about. So are you going to retain the building or sell it? So unlike Section 18, you're not required to dispose of the property. The housing authority as a legal entity could keep a fee interest in the property after a Section 18 approval is made. Or you could choose to sell it, and you could sell it to a third party that's unrelated to you, or you could sell it to some incarnation of yourself, either a corporation, a nonprofit, or a limited partnership, if that fits into your overall sort of corporate ownership structure that you're planning for your portfolio. So that there's a choice there for you. The method of sale needs to be discussed and presented to HUD. This looks a lot like it does for Section 18. So it's either fair market value or below fair market value. The idea of commensurate public benefit exists here. It's not technically called commensurate public benefit under Section 22. It's called good cause. The concept is the same. So what is the benefit that the public will get if the building is sold at less than fair market value? And then this attached PBB assistance. It is permissible. So this concept is whether you can preserve the building by project basing the vouchers received back into the building. So kind of to round this concept out, if you own this building as a housing authority, it's currently public housing, you seek Section 22 approval, and you get it, your residents then get their housing choice voucher. Your residents then have a choice to stay in that unit as your tenant, paying you rent that comes, and your revenue would then come from tenant pay portion and from the housing choice voucher. And the rents would be tied to fair market value, just as they are in Section 18. That resident could then also choose to move. They could say, this was great, but I'm going to move across town, or I'm going to move to a different state, I'm going to move. That's their choice. Or they could choose to return the voucher to you. And so this is where I go back to the idea of enhanced or robust resident consultation. So there's consultation at the front end, which is probably a group meeting with all the residents in the building where you talk about what you're going to do. There's then one-on-one consultation with the resident, which HUD has an interest in participating in, where you talk about what the options for the resident are and what they could choose to do with that voucher. They could choose at their discretion to give you that voucher back. And then if they do that, you could then choose to project-base that voucher into that building, creating a project-based subsidy, which that resident could choose to live in. So there is a path to get yourself to where you would preserve that building with project-based vouchers through Section 20. But along that way, residents have much more authority to exercise about what happens with the voucher than is the case with a Section 18 process. A lot of housing authorities are very interested in streamlined voluntary conversion because it provides this path to a tenant protection voucher by right if you are at 250 units or less. There's a lot of housing authorities which have 250 units or less. If you want to preserve that building through this more traditional preservation approach, the steps to get there look a little bit different. And so I think that there's just a lot more things to consider. It might be that the residents of that building would say, hey, I really have no interest in moving. I like it here. I'm not going anywhere, and I have no issue giving my voucher back to you. I've heard a lot of housing authorities talk about that being the likely case in buildings that are elderly and disabled, buildings that have very, very low turnover, people that have been living there for a long time who frankly might be fearful of moving or might not have other great options to move. So staying put is their best option. It might be that you get a high percentage of folks that want to turn their vouchers back to you so you can preserve that building. So it is possible to attach the assistance to the building, but there are additional steps to get there. The application to HUD itself, so you submit this conversion plan through the inventory removal submodule, which goes through the PIC process. The forms are a little bit different with Section 18, but you can see the elements of the plan as shown on this slide are very similar. So earlier on in this presentation, we looked at the slide that had the 3 rows of boxes that had the elements of a Section 18 plan. This is a very similar content. So it needs to be, this conversion needs to be in your annual plan or your MTW plan if you're one of those types of housing authorities. Significant resident participation. The notice requirement says 1 meeting, but as I mentioned before, there's going to be ongoing and very different by its nature interaction with residents if you go Section 22. Board approval, local government review, future use description. So what are you going to do with the property? What is your overall plan? What's your concept? A Part 58 environmental review, an impact analysis. So this is a little bit of a FHEO review that relates to concentrations of poverty, but also will touch on the relocation activities and access to housing in your community. So what is the probability, or what are the underlying fundamentals of your market as it relates to a housing choice voucher holder of a family size that lives in that building you're proposing, seeking other housing and being successful. Again, mandatory closeout. So you start the closeout process when you submit this plan. And then you need to either be a HCV agency or have partnered with one. So when you submit your application, you need to have identified who's going to be your partner. The processing of these goes through the SAC. So same folks there in downtown Chicago who will work on it. The timing for these, as I think is the timing with Section 18 as well, SAC is saying 90 days for a completed application. And so again, I go back to the point I made earlier about SAC's getting a lot of these, and they look at them quickly when they come in. And if they look complete and ready to review, they get reviewed. If they look incomplete, they let the Housing Authority know it's not ready to review yet. And then HUD approval. And like with RAD, like with Section 18, you should not start your process of relocation, should not start this process until you've got your dispo approval letter. And in this case, with Section 22, and your tenant protection vouchers are also in place. That is a separate process, so you go through that process separately from Section 18. And then obviously you don't have anything to give to your residents until you receive it from HUD. So you need to queue up the sequence of activities there accordingly. Impact on public housing funds is a little bit different than with Section 18 and with RAD. So under Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, a housing authority may spend cap funds for modernization activities up until the point that the property is removed from PIC. This is a difference from the Section 18 approach now. Properties removed under Streamlined Voluntary Conversion are not eligible for asset repositioning fee or DDTF. Again, you get mandatory closeout, so you're severing your Section 9 tie with HUD, and you will not receive DDTF or ARF, and that is unlike Section 18. Tenant protection vouchers eligibility. So same as before, units occupied within the last 24 months are eligible to, housing authorities are eligible to get a tenant protection voucher for units occupied in the last 24 months. And then the timing of those is the housing authorities apply after written approval of your conversion plan, and that goes in under a separate process. So your eligibility for the application is tied to approval of your Section 22 effort. The Streamlined Voluntary Conversion came out just last year under 2019-05, and you can read more about it here. I think it's fair to say that this is getting a lot of attention, and that there's still a lot of things that are being figured out. This idea of residents having a right to take that voucher or give it back, there's a lot embedded in that, and I think HUD is doing a good job, and housing authorities are doing a good job thinking through, well, what is that actually going to look like? There's a lot of interest in this. A lot of housing authorities think that it can work for them, and I think we're still at the front end of doing a lot of these transactions. All right, so I think our next slide is a knowledge check. It is. I'm going to stop before we get into the knowledge checks, Caitlin, and just open it up at this point and see if there's any questions about Streamlined Voluntary Conversion that we can take on.
Yeah, we've had a few come in. So, and these, unfortunately, their line can't be unmuted, but so the first question is, in the online FAQ section regarding SVC, there are some questions related to over-income tenants, and the two that they're referring to both say that HUD may be able to make limited exceptions to allow certain existing over-income residents to remain. They also say that HUD encourages PHAs to offer over-income residents an opportunity to stay in their units paying the same rent that they paid under the public housing program. Can you speak to this a little bit and just talk about if that's true and what that looks like?
Yeah, I can start, and I know I can give some general answers. So it has not been my experience, and I would be surprised if there's a path to kind of waive the basic housing choice voucher eligibility requirements that relate to income for participants. It's not been my experience that any of the programs, either Section 18 or Section 22, would allow for that. If you're switching to basically a resident being in the Section 8 program, and if they are over-incomed, what I have seen happen a lot is that the resident can stay in the building, and that what they pay is an amount that would be affordable to them for whatever their income is, and maybe that is the same amount as they had been paying if they were at a flat rent or a ceiling rent concept before. So they could stay put in the building until they decide to move. So this isn't an area that my sense is still evolving. We can borrow from what we've seen other programs do. So we know that Rad has some programs that allow folks to stay, so no one is displaced, and that they're accommodated, so to speak, if their incomes are high. But I haven't seen something as plain as deviating from housing choice voucher income eligibility to allow for that. And I think what, practically speaking, what would likely happen is that the resident could stay, they pay what they can afford, and then once they leave, then the housing authority can choose to do what they might otherwise with that unit. I know that we've got a couple of Kathy Zybis from the SAC is on the phone, and this is a part of the presentation that maybe Kathy could chime in as well. And she's right at the center of a lot of these conversations with housing authorities who are exploring ideas, and with HUD colleagues who are trying to figure out what the right response is going to be. So, Kathy, is there anything you'd want to add on that one?
No, Mike. I think generally, no. That's a pretty accurate response. HUD is working on more guidance to address these issues. One of the slight complications as to what you said about the resident being able to stay in place is it raises rent reasonableness issues that we're looking into in terms of whether a housing authority can allow that resident to stay in place while lease, especially if the intent is to PBV. So we're looking into these issues. Another thing we're looking into is whether the residents have the right to stay if they don't qualify for HCD assistance. And the current thinking is if they're over income, the housing authority doesn't have to give them the right to remain, unlike a resident that does qualify with HCD assistance, because statute says if a resident can remain in place with tenant-based assistance. So if someone doesn't qualify for tenant-based assistance, they don't necessarily have the right to remain, but the housing authority has to otherwise provide them with some kind of comparable housing off-site. So we're working on more guidance on this, so stay tuned. But yeah, these are really important, tricky questions.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. Thanks, guys. We'll go on to the next question. If a tenant with a TPV moves out, can we use one of our existing project-based vouchers in the unit?
Yeah. So if your tenant moves out, can you backfill? Short answer is yes. So the concept here that a lot of housing authorities are trying to get their head around is, let's say that you've got a 100-unit building, and it's your last 100 units, and so it's more than 50. So the Rad Section 18 closeout would be an option for you, but half your rents would be Rad, half would be Section 18, therefore TPVs, therefore indexed to FMR. So rather than doing that, you think, I'm going to go streamline voluntary conversion because I'm eligible, and I'll get 100% TPVs that have higher rents. So now the question is, well, will the residents be willing to turn that voucher back to me? So let's say that 75% of them say yes, They say, I've lived here forever, I have no interest in moving, I love you as my landlord, I'm going to give you my voucher back and let you project base my unit and stay here. If the other 25 say, no, I'm going to keep my voucher because I want to move, when they do move, the housing authority could then backfill that unit with a voucher out of its housing choice voucher pot, expand the HAP agreement that had been written, so it would go from 75 units to 76 units under this example, and now you've worked your way more closer to 100% project-based voucher building incrementally as residents move out. So you can do that. To do that, you need to have the capacity. You need to be ideally, you are your own housing choice voucher administrator. That might be seen as a slightly bigger ask if you're working with a buddy housing authority to do this for you because it's coming from their pot. But if you administer your own voucher program, it's something that you get to decide for yourself. You can do that by right as long as it occurs within, I'm going from memory here. I need to check, so I'm going to qualify this. It's either 2 or 5 years. I think it's 5 years is the duration of time that a housing authority has to project base a unit that had been a public housing unit and have it exempt from some of the relevant PBV rules. I'll revisit that and we'll come back to it in the next week when we pick that session up. So there's a window within which you have some flexibility on the PBV rules because that was a prior Section 9 building. You're still exempt, so you'd be exempt from your program and project caps. So that's something to think about. So depending upon how long it takes folks to choose to leave your building may have an impact on what the implications are on your program and project caps. But the concept is there. So if you're wanting to use Streamlined Voluntary Conversion as a preservation tool, that's generally what it would look like. It's frankly not the best preservation option just by virtue of its mechanics and the standing that residents have, but housing authorities do like it and are extremely interested in it because it's up to 250 units and it comes with tenant protection vouchers. So folks are trying hard to figure it out for those reasons. And it might very well be a good option for certain buildings in certain markets. So I think that's very situational.
So Mike, kind of related to that, if a tenant takes a TPV and moves out, we have to pay the moving costs, we as in the PHA?
So that's what the notice says, and I think there's some conversations around so what does that actually look like? So does that mean that you have to, if you're in Rhode Island and they want to move to California, does that mean you have to move them to California? I think there's been a lot of discussion around what is the obligation of the housing authority to cover those costs. And Kathy, I'll turn to you again and see if you have any updates on the current guidance that HUD is providing housing authorities in this regard.
No, I think that's accurate. And you make a good point. The housing authority has to pay the reasonable cost of relocation. And it's the housing authority's discretion to define reasonable. So as Mike pointed out, if someone wants to port their voucher out from Rhode Island to California, is that a reasonable moving expense? And, most people would say no.
Okay, thanks, Kathy.
Thanks. So another question. Under SBC, are all tenants given vouchers at the same time? What if a large number of your tenants want to use their vouchers and your vacancy shoots up? Who would fill your unit?
So are they all, I think the short answer to the first part of the question is yes. So you'd be on the same track, right? So you get your approval of your conversion plan. You then apply for your vouchers. Presumably you get all the vouchers at one time. And then you'd go through a process of onboarding those residents into your housing choice voucher program. So there would be an event where the property converts, right? So that event would be when you take it, you remove the DOT, it comes out of the PIC system off your ACC. So it's no longer a public housing unit. At that point, your residents then become housing choice voucher holders, and administratively, your organization needs to calibrate to sort of receiving revenue for that property in this different way. So everyone would shift. If folks decide to leave in mass at that point, then I think if I were in the housing authority who's considering this, I would want to think a lot about what my wait lists look like for that property. I would start early as I'm thinking about my Streamlined voluntary conversion effort. I would be running this building differently now. So it's no longer a public housing building, right? So it no longer follows your ACOP. It now follows your approach to how you want to lease this building. And so thinking about things like wait lists and how you would market would be something I would do early so that I could be in a place to backfill vacancies when they occur. Maybe you just want to borrow from your public housing wait list, and that's an easy way to do it. Maybe you want to think differently about it. I think there's some choices that housing authorities have in there, but getting it dialed in so that you can fill that, a potential large vacancy amount quickly is something to plan for.
And Mike, this is Kathy. I just wanted to add one thing on the TPV issue. So when you apply for TPVs, you can put in multiple years for lease up if you have a tighter rental market and you don't think you're going to be able to lease up everyone in the same leasing year. The part of the TPV applications allows you to put up a leasing schedule for multiple years. So that's one thing you could do if you think it's going to take a while. And then, yeah, so I guess that's the main point.
So just staying with that point real quick. So that leasing schedule appears in the I forget the number, the actual application for your TPVs that you submit. And I recall from that form that you lay out, what you think your lease up looks like. So then if HUD were then to say, oh, it looks like you need, and let's make this up, half the vouchers this year, half the vouchers next year. If you get half the if your award is then broken up, does that then also reflect how you would make the vouchers available to a resident in the building? Or I would think that you would need all the vouchers at one time because your revenue would need them. Because when you convert, you stop receiving your public housing subsidy, you would need to backfill.
Yeah, yes and no. I think you do get the budget authority for the TPVs all at once, notwithstanding multiple lease-up years. And in terms of when your public housing subsidy stops, we're kind of working on the nuances on that. Again, as Mike pointed out, there's no DDTF or ARF for conversions. And so we're looking to be what's the magic moment where your public housing subsidy is cut off. So generally what we're thinking is, at the point where after all of the families have been converted to HCV assistance through PIC in the 50058 and putting them in end of participation in the public housing program within PIC, then at that point HUD would move the units to remove from inventory RMI status in PIC after all units have been converted and residents are in HCV. And then at that point in the next funding cycle for OP and capital fund, you would no longer be eligible for new capital or operating funding.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks. Next question. If the resident takes the TPV, will their former unit continue to be subsidized?
If the resident takes the TPV. So if the resident says, I want to be a housing choice voucher holder and I want to go somewhere else, will the unit be subsidized? No, it will not. So HUD will replace the public housing subsidy that had been going to that unit by giving the housing authority a tenant protection voucher, which then is deployed to the resident as a housing choice voucher, who then moves across town with it. The housing authority now, if they've kept that building, they own that unit, but there's no subsidy tied to that unit, unless they choose to backfill from their own pot, which I was explaining before, and project base into that unit. If they don't do that, it's then an unsubsidized unit. The occupancy requirements for that unit would be a function of what was agreed to between the housing authority and HUD when the housing authority proposed the form of disposition, either fair market value or less than fair market value with commensurate public benefit. So if the housing authority said, no commensurate or commensurate public benefit, then HUD would have wanted there to be, again, at least 80% AMI for 30 years on that unit. So, depending upon what the housing authority chooses to do with the disposition will impact what the future obligations for occupancy look like in those units. And then what the resident does decides whether there's voucher subsidy or operating subsidy to that unit or not.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question, what is the time frame for removing units in PIC?
So two thoughts. One, I think HUD's expectation, just on the face of it, is that the units are removed within a short period of time after approval. And with Section 18, they talk about 7 days. This concept of removing it from PIC then touches on what Kathy had just mentioned about the lack of ARF, yet the appreciation for kind of a gentle transition. And so I think that the point Kathy made about HUD exploring what that transition is going to look like may touch on this idea of the technical removal from PIC. With Section 18, the expectation is 7 days from the conversion event.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And in Section 18, the 970 regulation specifically addresses this, and it says, within 7 days you have to notify HUD via PIC in your field office that the units have been demolished or disposed. Section 22, the 972 reg, doesn't really address this head on. So, yeah, again, we're looking maybe more towards the 50058 and the conversion of the residents. As Mike pointed out, this program conversion follows the residents more than the real estate. So we might be using that as the triggering event for PIC removals.
Thanks, guys. So I'm not seeing any more questions right now. We can go ahead and do the knowledge checks, and if anyone else has any more questions, feel free to type them in.
Okay, so I'll flip us forward here. So first knowledge check question for SCC is name the Streamlined Voluntary Conversion threshold requirements. So the poll is open. Multiple choice. Things you could click. All right. Go ahead and close the poll.
Yep, got about 10 seconds.
So the options are, or the requirements are, conversion primarily benefits residents. So this, again, this is one of these fundamental differences of Section 22, Streamlined Voluntary Conversion, from Section 18 in Rad. Really, the resident is more the center of the focus. And then the second one is the conversion has no adverse impact on the affordable housing in the community. So this gets into what, if not living in a public housing unit, where would these residents live if they had a voucher? That's the fundamental question there. All right. And I think our last knowledge check for the day. if a housing authority has SCC approval, can the family take their voucher assistance to Hawaii? All right, so yes or no, can they take their voucher assistance to Hawaii? Why don't we go ahead and close that one out? The answer is yes, they can take their assistance to Hawaii. So any participant in a housing choice voucher program can move around with their voucher. Now, whether or not the housing authority determines that the cost to move to Hawaii is reasonable is a matter for the housing authority to decide. But the question about being able to move is a resident decision. Questions about whether or not the cost to get there is reasonable is a housing authority judgment. All right, couple key takeaways related to streamlined voluntary conversion. So HUD issues tenant protection vouchers for units occupied within the last 24 months. So that's the same as Section 18. Public housing authorities that are PH-only organizations have to find a partner to administer these vouchers. Since so much of streamlined voluntary conversion is tied to running of a housing choice voucher program, you need to find a partner who will help you with that. Project-basing assistance is permissible, but the tenants have a lot of say. So it is possible to get to a preservation outcome with streamlined voluntary conversion, but your engagement with your residents will determine exactly what that's going to look like. So this, I'll go back again, as I have been, or the other day and today, to encouraging to think about your desired outcome for your properties, for your portfolio. What is it that you want to accomplish 5, 7, 10 years from now? And if it's preserving that building, maybe SCC isn't the best option. It is definitely an option, but there's some things that you need to figure out just what that's going to look like. So it's not impossible, but it's just a very different looking process than with Section 18. And then plan for the use of remaining public housing funds. And we'll talk about this more next week when we talk about closeout. Streamlined voluntary conversion requires that you have 250 units or less, and it comes with mandatory closeout. So if you have existing reserves, if you have DDTF or ARF from another conversion that you might have completed within what would be the last 5 years, so that would be that's the length of time for DDTF. Think about that, because your eligibility to continue to access that money would be impacted with mandatory closeout. And the last takeaway, so we talked about suspension closeout, and we'll talk more about that next week in more detail. All right, so this last slide just brings to focus some of the stuff we've been talking about, things to consider. Does your housing authority have public housing buildings that might qualify to be obsolete? And if so, how would you prove that? Are your units scattered? Do you have 250 units or less? So these are questions are a little bit of a preface or a prelude to the decision matrix conversation that we'll have next week, where we'll talk through some different ways to filter these criteria through the different programs with an eye towards your desired outcomes, and trying to focus on what's your preferred or what's your optimal option. A lot of this will come down to judgment, and a lot of it will turn on what you think is the right thing for your community. But sorting through the criteria and the different factors is is something that will help you think through next week. So that's it for the presentation today. And I'll see if there's any more general questions, again, that folks have. I think we give ourselves maybe a bit more time than we did last time, and we'll try to answer those. And we can also, I think, take them in written form, and if folks have them, and we can push them out through email once again, if that works for people.
Hey, Mike. So I think we did a really good job addressing people's questions throughout, and I'm not seeing any coming in at the moment. Give it a few more seconds. And I think the woman who asked the case study question is no longer on the line, so we'll save that and keep it for another day. But if anyone else has any questions for Mike, I can unmute their line, or you can type in the chat box.
Sounds like
okay, we just got one.
Good. Okay.
Is it within, what is the definition of contiguous? Is it within or near the same street on a map?
So contiguous is, as I understand it, how it applies it. So contiguous parcels would be parcels which adjoin each other. There's also some discussion in the notice about buildings that share systems, which would be a very odd situation to have buildings sharing a system if they were not on contiguous land parcels. But maybe that happens. But the idea of contiguous means land parcels that touch each other.
So is this question related to the scattered site? It sounds like. So just to clarify, SAC is taking a somewhat broad definition of contiguous under the Section 18 scattered site reason, and provided that there's not more than 4 units in the same block, we would allow kind of 2 scattered site single-family homes to be next to each other, even though they're technically contiguous.
Thank you for that. So, and that came up, Kathy, when we were talking about something else recently. So, just to make that real for a second, so if I'm a housing authority and I own a single-family house that's on a lot, and so it's 1 unit, 1 building, 1 lot, and on the lot next door, there's 1 building, 1 unit, 1 lot. They're technically contiguous, but it's less than 4 units. So that would be considered scattered. If that line didn't exist, and if those 2 units were in that lot line, those 2 units were in a single building, that would still meet the definition. So that's what you meant by broad definition. So if the lots are contiguous, that doesn't preclude it so long as there's less than 4 units combined.
Correct.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions at this time.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for participating today. And we will tune in again next Tuesday at the same time to continue with the training. And appreciate your interest in this topic. And until then, have a good weekend.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. And I just want to give one more plug for the survey that will pop up after this. If you could please fill it out, we would really appreciate it. Thanks.